Welcome this evening. I'm very glad to see so many people here. This is the first of three in the series of our Keswick Hall Lectures, of which this is the fourth series annually. Yep. I think so. It's going back quite a while. And I think it's a very exciting evening. We're going to talk this evening about free speech, hate speech, and faith speech. I'm very interested in this. My name's Charles Clark. I'm a visiting professor here at the university, because when I was Home Secretary, we passed legislation on the subject of hate speech, about which I've talked to Alex a lot, who's going to discuss it in more detail in a minute. And I work now on the question of the place of faith in public life, so I'm extremely interested in these areas. We're very fortunate this evening in having three top academics to discuss the subject. And the structure of this evening is I'm going to introduce them in a second and ask each of them to talk for about 15 minutes on their particular subject, and then have an open discussion, and we'll run, I hope, till about 8 o'clock, something like that. I won't go past 8 o'clock in any case. This is being recorded, so please be aware of this in the questions and discussions that you, at any points that you want to make. As I say, the three subjects we're discussing are free speech, which Professor Rachel Potter is going to introduce, hate speech, which Alex Brown is going to introduce, and faith speech, which Lee Marsden is going to introduce. They've all studied these subjects in some detail. The interrelationship with them is not straightforward and easy, and I hope that part of the things that will emerge in this conversation is the difficulty to thinking about the relationship between these three different ideas and concepts. And we're very fortunate to start this evening with Rachel Potter, who's the Professor of Modern Literature at this university. And perhaps, Rachel, I can just ask you to kick off and give us the first session on this. 15.
Okay. A few years ago, I published a book. It was about the history of literary censorship in the early 20th century. So I was focusing on writers such as James Joyce and D.H. Lawrence, who were famously prosecuted for publishing obscene books. And I was interested in the legal structures in place at the time, the moral norms that led these books into the law court, so to speak. But I was also interested in why it was that writers such as Joyce and Lawrence wanted to incorporate sex, sexual slang, and blasphemous obscenity into their literary novels. So the book was partly also about how in the late 50s there was a kind of freeing up of the legal norms and moral norms on censorship, and free expression in literature was made more free. And I was also interested in the way in which those early 20th century writers and artists had somehow contributed to those shift in cultural attitudes. So I was kind of pleased with my new book, and I went about trying to find a picture to put on the cover of it. And I was delighted when I found a sculpture by an artist called Brancusi called Princess X, and there it is. I thought this was really good because it captured some of the arguments of my book really well. So on the one hand, it's about the artistic incorporation of the sexualized body into the artwork. It's also got that move towards abstraction, which is very important to modernist and avant-garde writing and art in the early 20th century. And it was also banned for being obscene in the 1920s. So I happily sent it along to my editor. Imagine my surprise when I got an email back from her. She said, "Love the image, really captures the argument of your book brilliantly, but we can't possibly use it as the cover of your book because it might cause offence, not in the UK, but in some of our other territories globally." Now, the irony of this situation was not lost on myself or my editor, but the decision had to stand, and I had to find a different image for the front of my book. Now, this story, I think, captures three things that I think are quite important in contemporary free speech debates. The first is that free speech debates are now international debates. In other words, this image was seen as pretty inoffensive to UK readers, but it was seen as potentially very offensive to readers in other parts of the world. Second issue, the word censor originally denoted the activities of a single individual in ancient Rome who had to decide whether writing should be allowed to circulate or not. And that meaning of censor sort of carries over into the modern sense that censorship is something that happens by governments and in law courts. But actually the reality is a lot of censorship happens in other places, in publishing houses, in big multinational corporations, for instance, Google, Facebook, Twitter. These are all platforms that have to make decisions about what can and cannot go onto those platforms. Universities, even just the private decisions that an individual might take to self-censor what they're going to write because of fears of personal safety. Now, in the case of a publisher, they're making commercial decisions about that rather than strictly legal ones. But nevertheless, it does have an impact on the kind of information that we have access to. Now, everything I've just said is kind of talking about censorship, and I've actually been asked to talk about free speech. But I think, in fact, the two are so closely related, you can't really understand one without the other. Nevertheless, I'm going to just outline 4 key arguments that historically have been made to say why free speech is so important. First argument is that it's fundamental to what it means to be a human being. And in a 20th century language, a 20th century version of that would be, it's a universal human right. You only have to look to history to see those moments when people's ability to speak freely has been taken away from them, to see how profoundly they feel that the absence of the ability to speak freely affects their human dignity and their sense of themselves as a person. And this is a very ancient idea. Socrates was forced to drink hemlock because he refused to give up speaking freely, although actually he never really discusses free speech as such in his writings. The second key argument that is made in defense of free expression is that it's essential to the discovery of truth. John Stuart Mill famously argued that the exchange of opinion is fundamental for the testing, the refinement, and the strengthening of truth claims. He argued that even if someone's opinion seems to be false, it might have a grain of truth in it, and for that reason it should not be silenced. He also argued that if truths become so established that they're never tested and questioned, they become kind of lazy truths. They become dogma, and therefore that is also a barrier to the pursuit of truth and new ideas. The third argument that's made in defense of free expression is that it's fundamental to a functioning democracy. So democracies are very, they tend to say one of the defining features of a democratic system of government is the right to speak freely in opposition to authoritarian regimes. But it's also the case that it works the other way around. You can't have a proper functioning democracy without free speech. And again, this is an old idea. Ancient Greek democracy was predicated on the idea that Greek citizens should have the ability to question those in authority, to speak freely. And in its modern form, it's why we value a free press. It's why we value the ability to call governments to account, to have checks and balances on their power so they do not abuse it. And finally, the fourth argument for free speech that I think is important is that it's seen as fundamental to the functioning of a multi-faith society. And here, free speech is connected to another key category, which is tolerance. Tolerance has been an important idea in Western philosophy for a long time, since the 18th century, particularly in arguments about how multi-faith societies can function harmoniously. And the idea is that groups with a particular religious faith must have the ability and the right to express that faith, but at the same time, they have to tolerate groups of other faiths at the same time. And if we bring this up today and think about what it means to live in a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-gendered, multi-sexual society, which many of us live in, it's very important that free speech and tolerance are at the heart of that. So those are 4 arguments that historically have been made as to why free speech is important, and there are many others, but for me those are some of the key ones, and they're philosophical arguments. So in some senses, really free speech, it takes place in other forms. In other words, those are philosophical arguments, but the reality is that free speech in every society is also always curtailed. So it's not the case that we're all allowed to speak freely, and that's a good thing. So many societies would say that there should be limits on the propagation of hate speech, and hate speech is defined as speech that's directed towards a particular minority group and has the intention or the potential to incite violence towards that group. Another area is that most societies, and this is true around the world, prohibit the development and dissemination of child pornography. And probably most people in the room would think that those limits on free expression are a good thing. I mean, I hope I'm not presuming there. But I think we think that limits are often a good thing, that you can't have free speech in all situations. So I think it's at those limits point that the real decisions about free speech are made, the balance between the right to speak freely and the harm that speaking freely might have on other groups, and that it's those boundaries in which those decisions are made. But going back to some of the issues I raised in relation to the story of publishing my book, how do those arguments play out in an international arena? So one of the things that is a feature of our life is that there are modern communication systems, most obviously the internet. And in some senses, this means that the ability to speak freely and to be heard by millions of people has never been so strong. But at the very same time, it's also the case that the internet poses a big threat to free speech. The internet is a very powerful form of surveillance. And this was revealed just this week when WikiLeaks released a series of files which appear to be of CIA surveillance mechanisms. And all I would say is watch what you say in front of your television or your iPhone or your computer. The other thing I mentioned at the beginning was the word offence. Now, I think offence has become a key term in debates about free expression, and historically that's happened fairly recently. And I think the coordinates of this changed, certainly in the UK, after the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses affair in the late 1980s. And at that point, what happened was, there was no question that that novel was seen as blasphemous and deeply offensive to many Muslims in the UK and worldwide. But that wasn't really the question. The question was, given that it was offensive to many people, should it actually be prohibited? And at the time, the British government and most cultural commentators in the UK said, no, we don't think it should be prohibited. Certainly Salman Rushdie has always been a strong proponent of the idea that you can't censor a novel, a postmodern novel that playfully sort of toys with issues of faith and is blasphemous, but is still a fictional piece of writing. Because if you were to do so, you'd have to silence the whole history, the last 200 years of literary expression, and certainly Ulysses would have to go because Ulysses is deeply blasphemous with regard to the Catholic Church. But I think if you look at that moment then, and you then move forwards 30 years, you see how those cultural coordinates have changed quite a bit in the UK. So if we take the Charlie Hebdo affair that happened a couple of years ago, which was also an issue around blasphemous offence and the insulting of religion and Islam, you can see that the response to that was very different in Britain. I'm just focusing on Britain here. So, of course, all the newspapers lamented the hideous violence that had been perpetrated, but most British newspapers, bar one or two, decided not to republish those cartoons in their pages, and they gave a variety of reasons for that. One reason given was, we do not want to cause offence to our readers. Another reason given was, we don't want to put our employees in danger. So there were various reasons, but you could see that the sense of that had changed quite considerably. But alongside those developments, other things have also developed, and I'm going to finish by just talking about something that I think is very true of the current moment. And this involves almost like stepping outside. I think that when you look at the history of censorship, you see that there are key moments when things shift, when cultural coordinates shift, and it involves stepping outside and sort of looking at how free speech as a term itself is being used. And I think what's happened in the last few years is that a number of writers and commentators have defended hate speech on the grounds of free speech. And it's not really just that, it's that they've also produced a narrative about that. And the narrative is that free speech is part of a Western tradition and culture that is at threat by a non-Western, by which they mean an Islamic, religious authoritarianism. And that narrative is a construction, okay? And it's a politicization of free speech. And I think that one has to see that as a kind of political battle. It's the complete opposite to what I was describing earlier, that the idea that free speech is important for a multi-faith society and tolerance and the ability for faith to coexist. It's become a politicized term. Now, that's not new in the history of free expression. If you think back to the 1950s, free expression was a key term in the Cold War. So the example of the Russian dissident writer was sort of held up as a beacon of someone whose free speech rights were being denied, and hence all of the Western values that went along with that. That's not to deny that it was horrendous for the Soviet writer who has been denied their right to free speech. It's merely to say that free speech is a kind of human right that is extremely valuable to all of us. It is extremely important to the functioning of a proper democracy and all of those other things I described earlier. But it's also a term that is fought over, and never more so than at the present moment. Thank you.
Rachel, that was absolutely tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. You've got us off to a tremendous start. Our second speaker is Dr. Alex Brown, who's going to talk about hate speech, the very point on which Rachel concluded. He published a book a year or so ago, Hate Speech Law, a Philosophical Examination, an attempt to address some of these issues in a way which I would say, in praise of his book, hasn't been done in any other publication in a serious way. And so, Alex, we're very much looking forward to what you have to say about hate speech, both building on what Rachel has said, but I'm sure taking the discussion further forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. When we are children, we quickly learn, and for the most part we accept, that bad behaviour is not limited to kicking, biting, throwing food. Saying the wrong thing at the wrong time can count as bad behaviour as much as anything else. Parents tell their children it is generally wrong to steal, and it is generally wrong to hit, and it's wrong to say mean things about other people because their skin is another colour, or because they are disabled, or because they're fat or wearing glasses or have ginger hair. For some children born into religious households, these norms are often informed by their religious beliefs and practices. For others, they are just common sense norms of human respect. When we are adults, even between the ages of 10 and 17, we enter the world of adult laws, and there we find laws against theft and laws against assault and laws against hate speech. Indeed, if one studies the criminal codes, media regulations and civil laws of countries around the world, one finds that hate speech laws are ubiquitous. But of all the laws I've just mentioned, it is hate speech laws that often cause people particular worry. It seems that as adults, some of us quickly learn to be skeptical about those laws, even to reject them out of hand. Many adults come to embrace what Diana Myers has dubbed the bratty kid view of free speech. It's a free country, I have a right to say whatever I want. But why do we think that speech in the area of rules should end when we become adults? Maybe we just think that as adults, we should always be responsible ourselves for deciding what we ought to say, to make our own moral choices about the limits of free speech. But we don't say that about the limits of property or integrity of the body. I can't just take what's yours or put my fist in your eye because that's what I've decided is morally okay. So why should it be different for speech? Or perhaps the thought is that hateful words are not really harmful words, so we should never legislate against them. Remember what else we tell children. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And recall this exchange between Scout and Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. Scout, says Atticus, nigger lover is just one of those terms that don't mean anything, like snot-nose. It's hard to explain. Ignorant, trashy people use it when they think somebody's favoring Negroes over and above themselves. It slipped into usage when some people like ourselves, when they want a common, ugly term to label somebody. You aren't really a nigger lover then, are you? I certainly am. I do my best to love everybody, but I'm hard put sometimes. It's never an insult to be called what somebody thinks is a bad name. It just shows you how poor that person is. It doesn't hurt you. But it's perhaps much easier for Atticus Finch, a professional man, a white man, a man, to not be hurt, to turn the other cheek. Historically, for an African-American person to be called Negro has had the gravest consequences for his or her legal status. Consider the South Carolina Slave Code of 1740, which declared all Negroes and Indians, mulattoes and mestizos are now or shall hereafter be in this province, and all their issue and offspring shall be, and there are hereby declared to be, and remain hereafter absolute slaves. The assumption that words, including hate speech, are just words and cannot really hurt was largely debunked by the critical race theorists during the 1990s. That research has been extended over time, and we now have insights into the harms of a range of forms of hate speech. In England and Wales, some of the evidence suggests that when people use threatening words or behaviour with the intention of stirring up hatred against other people based on their race or religion, for example, this can exacerbate tensions between sections of society and can lead to public disorder. Following the end of the Second World War, Britain saw a significant increase in immigration from the West Indies, India, Bangladesh and Pakistan. By 1958, some parts of Britain, most notably Notting Hill and London, were the scenes of violence and race riots between whites and West Indian blacks. Fast forward to 1995, and a district in Bradford, West Yorkshire, was the scene of 3 days of rioting, including violence between the police and South Asian residents. Then again in 2001, both Bradford and Burnley saw conflict between the city's British Asian population and its white British residents. In 2005, in Birmingham, there was conflict between people with Afro-Caribbean origins and people of South Asian descent. What had previously been public order based on racial tensions and economic deprivation now took on complex racial, ethnic, and religious dimensions, relating not merely to poverty, but also, in some instances, to people with minority ethno-religious identities, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, feeling the need to assert themselves. So arguably, there is a pressing need for some public order laws banning the stirring up of hatred in this country. But of course, at the same time, many people also have legitimate concerns about the impact of such laws on freedom of expression. Many of those people happen to be secularists. So when laws were introduced in 2006 to make it a public order offence to use threatening words or behaviour with the intention of stirring up hatred against people on grounds of religion, some secularists worried that the offence would outlaw mere criticism of religious beliefs. And so the law was amended to include freedom of expression. It states that mere criticism of religion shall not be taken of itself to be threatening or intended to stir up hatred. And many people who are concerned about free speech also happen to be religious believers. So when laws were introduced in 2008 to make it a public offence to use threatening words or behaviour with the intention of stirring up hatred against people on grounds of their sexual orientation, some religious believers worried that the offence would outlaw the mere criticism of homosexual conduct or same-sex marriage. And so the law was amended again to include another freedom of expression clause. It states that the mere criticism of homosexual conduct or same-sex marriage shall not be taken of itself to be threatening or intended to stir up hatred. So bearing all of this in mind, in this lecture I want to ask the following two questions, which are anything but simple, to steal a phrase from Mill. First, why, from the perspective of religious community, is free speech valuable? And second, do religious communities have an absolute right to freedom of expression? So to begin with the first question, I shall offer three reasons why freedom of expression matters deeply to religious believers. One way has to do with cultural transmission and socialization. Whether religious culture is something persons choose to adopt or is instead something persons simply find themselves immersed in, or a subtle mixture of both, to suppress the communicative practices through which the culture is created, transmitted and embodied is bad for people who identify with religious culture. Think how much religious freedom of expression matters to people who tell stories to their children to help them learn and understand the articles of their faith. A second reason why freedom of expression matters to religious believers has to do with self-expression. It is often said that free speech is valuable because it is an indispensable means for expressing something about ourselves outwardly, a way of telling the world who we are and what we stand for. This is no less true of religious self-expression. Religious believers have the right, as everyone else, to use speech for the purposes of telling the world who they are. For people who stand on street corners to preach, this is as much about self-expression as about spreading the word. A third reason has to do with religious practice. It bears emphasis that religious identity is composed not merely of religious belief, but also of religious practices of performing one's religion. For some religious believers, that performance is done with and through speech. Think of the importance of the Hare Krishna mantra in certain movements or schools of Hinduism. A law banning the Hare Krishna mantra would be, in effect, a law banning certain religious movements themselves. For some evangelical and other Christians, being able to speak freely in public about the teachings of Jesus is partly constitutive of being an evangelical Christian. We now turn to our second question: what, if any, should be the limits to religious freedom of expression, now we know its value? As far as some religious believers are concerned, and we can find small numbers of believers of this kind across all major religions, being able to publicly denounce homosexual practices in the strongest possible terms is a religious duty. And for a small number, even smaller, this remains a religious duty in their eyes, even when they do it in such extreme ways that it crosses the line into being incitement to hatred against homosexuals. So there can be a tension between religious freedom of speech and the rights of other people not to be subject to incitement to hatred. And I do not think we can define away this tension simply by declaring that some practices are essential to a person's religious identity and some practices are not essential, and then by simply lumping any religious speech that crosses the line into being incitement to hatred against homosexuals into the non-essential category. In the eyes of some religious believers, everything they say about homosexuals is essential to their religious identity. Instead, we should focus on the following point. If the general right to freedom of expression supports a derivative right to religious freedom of expression, then just as the general right is not absolute, then so the derivative right cannot be absolute. Consider a religious person who claims that he has a right to shout fire in a crowded theatre when he knows there is no fire, or a right to publish information on how to make explosive devices on the internet. Even if he claimed that this was essential religious performance, we would not say that this right should be respected. It is trumped by people's right to safety and security. It is certainly true that from the perspective of laws in England and Wales, even under the Human Rights Act 1998, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. Article 326 of the immigration rules sets out the following grounds on which leave to enter the country can be refused, where the Secretary of State for the Home Department, the Home Secretary, has personally directed that the exclusion of a person from the UK is conducive to the public good. In August 2005, in the wake of the 7/7 bombings, Charles Clarke, the then Home Secretary, set forth an indicative list of unacceptable behaviours to be used as a basis for such exclusions, including the following: to express views which glorify terrorist violence in furtherance of particular beliefs, seek to provoke others to terrorist acts, foment other serious criminal activity or seek to provoke others to serious criminal activity, or foster hatred which might lead to inter-community violence in the UK. The immigration rules have been used repeatedly by successive Home Secretaries to ban radical Muslim clerics from entering the UK, but they've also been used to ban radical evangelical pastors. In February 2009, Jackie Smith issued an exclusion against Fred Phelps and Shirley Phelps Roper of the Westboro Baptist Church, Kansas. This came in response to a post on the picket schedule of their website, godhatesfags.com, declaring an intention to picket a performance of the gay rights awareness play The Laramie Project at Queen Mary's College in Hampshire. The words of the posting were as follows: Central Studio, Queen's Mary College, God hates your queen. In merry old England, they plan to further enrage the living God by putting the farce known commonly as the Laramie Project. Now, this is interesting. We will picket them and see if they actually believe those lies they tell about how tolerant and accepting Brits are. Right. Just because you rage against God and make laws that say you cannot use hate speech, aka you may not speak the Bible standards, in the UK, it does not mean you will get the message, that you'll not get the message that God Almighty intends for you to get. God hates England. Your queen is a whore. You hate God. God hates you. You're going to hell. Matt is in hell. Hell is real. Ask Matt. God hates fags. Obey God. Some of the best Bible preaching in the history of the world came out of the dark, dismal land, but is now full of abominations. God will shortly destroy the UK and the world, but not until they have gotten the plain, clear message that they will not be without an excuse. Was this action of banning entry to the Westboro Church justified? I believe it was, but on grounds that are a little more nuanced and subtle than the aforementioned list of unacceptable behaviours. In a country that has a history of racial and religious violence and rioting, it is not difficult to see why blocking certain religious extremists might be justified on grounds of preventing inter-community violence. But it is perhaps harder to make that case when the religious believers in question are targeting not members of other religious communities, but members of the LGBT community. The experience of Westboro Baptist Church picketing in the US has largely been one of more or less peaceful, albeit loud, picketing and counter-protesting, not violence and rioting. Indeed, when new laws banning the stirring up of hatred on grounds of sexual orientation were introduced, nobody seriously suggested that the UK was on the brink of a kind of sexual orientation war, heterosexual versus homosexual, much less Christian versus homosexual. So maybe what matters here is not public order in the literal sense of riots. Instead, one might focus on the more indirect harms of the anti-gay speech of organisations like the Westboro Baptist Church. Arguably, when people use threatening words or behaviour with the intention of stirring up hatred against others because of their possession or perceived possession of certain protected characteristics, this can contribute to a climate of hatred in which acts of discrimination and violence, including hate crimes against the relevant groups, are more likely, and to a climate of fear in which people from the relevant groups experience a heightened sense of fear and anxiety about their security. I believe that it's this rationale that sheds light on the stirring up hatred offences themselves. Recall that in 2008, the legislation stated that mere criticism of homosexual conduct or same-sex marriage shall not be taken of itself to be threatening or intended to stir up hatred. However, it does not say that anti-gay speech can never be taken to be threatening or intended to stir up hatred. And indeed, sometimes it can. Consider the legal case R v Ali, Javed and Ahmed. In July 2010, 3 devout but also socially conservative members of the Muslim faith distributed leaflets on the streets of Derby titled "Turn or Burn, Gay God Abhors You," in a protest to a gay pride festival taking place that day. One leaflet depicted a mannequin swinging from a hangman's noose with the caption "Death Penalty?" Next to that was information that in 1533 buggery was punished by hanging. On the other side was text which said that the only debate among classical religious authorities about homosexuality was the way of carrying out the execution, whether by burning, flinging from some high place or stoning. The defendants became the first people to be successfully prosecuted for offences relating to stirring up hatred on grounds of sexual orientation in England and Wales. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Burgess articulated the law's rationale as follows. For the vast majority of the time, the vast majority of us get along together very well. And the greatest freedom that we all enjoy is to live in peace and without fear. The law has evolved and adapted to protect that freedom. Speaking to the local press after the sentences had been handed down, Chief Inspector Sunita Gamblin of the Derbyshire Constabulary echoed Judge Burgess's rationale. When opinion and belief spill over into hatred, as seen in this case, it makes people feel threatened. No one should be made to feel fearful simply because of their sexual orientation or any other characteristic. These remarks shed light on why the laws are framed as they are, in my opinion. When it comes to stirring up hatred on grounds of religion or sexual orientation, the words or behaviour in question must be threatening. At first glance, this restricted wording is hard to understand. If the concern is ultimately with the likelihood of hatred being stirred up, why restrict the offences to only threatening words or behaviour? Why not also include insulting, derogatory, stigmatising or defamatory words? One possible answer, my answer, is that these offences are really designed to pinpoint the subjective element of insecurity, that is, to deter attacks on people's sense of personal security. What is more, the legislative focus on threatening words reflects the logical connection between such words and the fear they induce. It is part of the point and purpose of threatening words that they instill fear in others. So far, I have set out limits, legal and philosophical, to religious speech. But are these limits outrageous to common sense or to public opinion? No. Last week, I commissioned YouGov to undertake a representative weighted poll of 2,000 British adults for the purposes of this evening's talk, and thank you to Lee for part funding this question, and to ask people their attitudes about incitement to hatred laws in the UK. I asked them this question. In England and Wales, it is currently against the law to use threatening words to stir up hatred against other people on grounds of race, religion, sexual orientation. The mere discussion shall not be counted as intending to stir up hatred or threatening. Do you think the following types of speaker should or should not be exempted from such laws? 71% said that religious believers should not be exempted. 71% said that religious believers should not be exempted. These figures did not vary significantly depending on their political affiliation, how you voted in the last general election of those people polled, or their gender, or their age, or their class, or their geographical region. The numbers were broadly similar. One thing that YouGov did not supply, however, the budget didn't run that far, was figures broken down by religious believers as to whether they thought that they should be exempted from these laws. So let me ask you, do you think that religious believers themselves recognise that there should be limits on the sorts of language they use? Thank you.
Alex, that was really excellent. Thank you very much. And I'm going to finish the panel, but I suggest we do ask your question later on to everybody, and so please bear it in mind when we're going through. Thank you very much indeed. Our third presenter, dealing with faith speech, is Professor Lee Marsden, who's head of the School of Politics, Philosophy, Language and Communications here at UEA, and has done a great deal of his research work on this area. Lee.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Charles. And thank you very much for coming. We've heard about sort of free speech, and we've heard about hate speech, and these are probably terms which you're quite familiar with. What's less known, I guess, or less understood is the idea of faith speech. And so in terms of faith speech, is it a matter of just what religious people say? Is it a matter of people talking about their faith? And what I want to do is to provide some form of definition or working definition that I'm working with at the moment in terms of trying to understand faith speech, and then to sort of try and put that into some kind of context about how that can be used, how that might be beneficial in society. And we begin with a problem, really, I guess, whereby the religious voice seems to be very marginalised, particularly within the United Kingdom. So we look at religion and people of faith as being problems, or people who need to be controlled in some way, or ridiculed in terms of actually speaking out in the public square. And so I think it's important when we sort of think about faith speech to say what it's not. And what it's not is this guy here, wonderful guy, wonderful name, Creflo Dollar, who's a Word of Faith minister, and basically part of the name it and claim it gospel, a prosperity preacher. Now, they have sort of claimed the idea of sort of faith as their own, as it were, in that they are now, believe if you speak out particular Bible verses, you believe those, you claim them, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, that prosperity, that health can come to you. A lot of TV evangelists receive a lot of publicity. A lot of people around the Trump administration come from this particular background. But it's not him we're talking about. It's not this guy either, Mitt Romney. Now, Mitt Romney, before the last election in the United States, before one, the United States, as a Mormon, faced all kinds of problems about what sort of president he would be if he were able to stand. And so he made a speech about his faith, about his beliefs. And that follows on from a tradition of politicians having to explain exactly where they are in terms of their faith position. So Barack Obama, to prove he wasn't a Muslim, to prove he was sort of a bona fide American, came out with his faith speech. The first Catholic president, JFK, again, had to make a speech about his religion. So it's been seen in the terms of that being a faith speech. If you Google this, it automatically comes up as being a faith speech. I'm going to suggest that those aren't necessarily faith speeches. They're speeches about faith rather than faith speech itself. It's not this woman either, on the steps of Downing Street, when she quotes the phrases of Francis of Assisi, where there is discord, may there be harmony. Where there is error, may there be truth. And where there is doubt, may we bring faith. It's not about that. Because what there needs to be in terms of faith speech, I believe, is a genuine connection between the belief of the person actually saying the words, their lived out experience, and the impact of those statements. It's not this guy either. Though he will use and has used frequently, he'll slip in Bible passages, most recently at the speech to the Congress, where speaking to a widow of a fallen US serviceman, uses the passage from the Bible where he talks about greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. That's not what we're talking about. Neither is it talking about just how you put a good speech together. We're not talking about motivational or inspirational speeches, though the place of rhetoric is important, and many of the people who will use faith speech will have mastered the ideas of sort of ethos, logos, and pathos in delivering their words. But what I'm going to propose to you is a working definition of faith speech, which is this. Faith speech appeals directly to our higher selves. It sees the desired outcome from the beginning and works towards that end as though it were already achieved. The work takes place first in hearts and minds and subsequent actions. It retains that belief regardless of setbacks, knowing that the outcome will be achieved. Faith speech will always unite, not divide, and it will always build, not destroy. It's into building bridges, not building walls. And that's important. So, I apologise, the lighting is playing havoc here, but so it appeals to our higher selves. There's something within each one of us that knows we can perform better, that we can be a better person, at our best. That's something we aspire to be all the time, and very often we don't live up to that. But there's an appeal to that better self. It sees the desired outcome. So whatever the goal, the aspiration is, that we see that as something which is clearly visible, but also becomes part of the present reality, because we can absorb that. We've absorbed it, we believe in it, and it actually becomes part of our consciousness. It becomes part of our hearts and minds, and we act in accordance with that. No matter what setbacks occur on the way, they're just obstacles on that way to that fulfillment of the desired goal. And I'm going to suggest there are sort of 5 aspects to faith speech in particular. The first one begins by sort of identifying the problem, whatever the problem might be. And we can think of sort of great speeches of the past. I think of Martin Luther King, Barack Obama, some of his speeches, John F. Kennedy, as I've already referred to. But in terms of identifying the problem, for Martin Luther King, race, civil rights, human rights would be some part of the problem. For Barack Obama, sort of a divided nation would be part of the problem. For JFK, the sort of challenge of communism, but also the opportunities which are opening up in a world which is changing very, very rapidly. And we have our own problems today. We have a very uncertain world. Brexit and Trump are manifestations of uncertainty. The sort of the certainties of globalization, of sort of a neoliberal order, all are becoming questioned. And it creates dis-ease and dissatisfaction. So we have to identify what the problem is. In faith speech, there's an appeal to the higher self is actually made. This wanting to be better than we are, to be our best. And an appeal to the higher self will deal with issues like unity, freedom, justice, those big issues which actually cause us to soar above the minutiae, the everyday, and to dream and to see bigger things, and to see a bigger picture, see in the macro rather than in the micro. I'm not sure how clearly you can see this, but if you can see the screen, at the top I put a picture of Cinderella. Why is that? Well, actually fairy tales, nursery tales, are important. Why are they important? They're important because we train our children through nursery tales. And there's always a plot to every nursery tale. Basically, things are going pretty well, or might not be going so well. A problem comes, get over the problem, things are going okay. Another big problem comes, and then it's all solved at the end. There's a sort of a typical sort of pattern to that. And what happens in most nursery tales is that the good guys come out on top. Now, everybody knows that in the real world, that's not how it works out, but there is something within each one of us which says, actually, that's the way life should be. If you do the right thing, you should come out on top. And so that appeal to that sort of higher level.
Just as I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
And those sort of soaring words, and you could picture this as the whole speech, really, the I have a dream speech, but that encapsulates sort of that higher ground, sort of believing in greater, not just in greater possibilities, but the ability of the individual to rise to those challenges and to take part in those challenges. Thirdly, the idea that we are reminded that there is a higher authority. And this is sort of a very unpopular concept this side of the Atlantic, because we live in a secular environment, and to have openly express one's faith, particularly in political terms, is regarded as somehow problematic or a weakness. Tony Blair famously didn't do God. And when politicians have tried to do God, they've tiptoed through that and sort of put their toe in the water, and obviously, and very often been shot down with that. Kennedy said, John Kennedy at his inaugural address, the belief that the rights of man come not from generosity, not from the state, but from the hand of God. And that sort of fits quite well within sort of American context. It would be unheard of for a British Prime Minister to come out with a similar statement. But the idea that there is some higher authority, it could be just your higher self, but actually a belief that there is a higher authority becomes an important and integral part of faith speech. Fourthly, needs to be vision. It's seeing an end to racism. It's seeing equality. It's seeing emancipation. It's seeing justice. And being able to express that. Proverbs says, without a vision, the people perish. Another version says they're unrestrained. We need to know where we're going. And faith speech, I believe, helps us to understand that and to get there. Martin Luther King said this, I just want to do God's will. And this is the speech he made before he was assassinated. Just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. There's that sort of sense of vision, that sense of destiny, that no matter what obstacles are there, that this is a journey. You may not see it in a lifetime, but it's a journey that we're on. For Barack Obama, 2004 Democratic Convention, said this, it's no longer think of America in terms of not a liberal America or a conservative America, but a United States of America. Not a black America, not a white America, not a Latino America, not an Asian America, but the United States of America. He had a vision. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not yet seen. Some key words in that. There's the substance and there's the evidence. Martin Luther King had the substance of race equality. He had the substance of Negro Americans going into the promised land. He had that substance. The evidence was that belief. The evidence was that vision. And everything that he did was towards that end. He owned it right in the present time. And because he owned it in the present time, the fulfillment of that may not come in his lifetime, or indeed in Barack Obama's presidency, but it's coming.
In the end, that's what this election is about. Do we participate in a politics of cynicism, or do we participate in a politics of hope? I'm not talking about blind optimism here, the almost willful ignorance that thinks unemployment will go away if we just don't think about it, or healthcare crisis will solve itself if we just ignore it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about something more substantial. It's the hope of slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs, the hope of immigrants setting out for distant shores, the hope of a young naval lieutenant bravely patrolling the Mekong Delta, the hope of a mill worker's son who dares to defy the odds, the hope of a skinny kid with a funny name who believes that America has a place for him too. Hope in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty, the audacity of hope. In the end, that is God's greatest gift to us, the bedrock of this nation, a belief in things not seen, a belief that there are better days ahead. I believe that we can give our middle class relief and provide working families with a road to opportunity. I believe we can provide jobs to the jobless, homes to the homeless, and reclaim young people in cities across America from violence and despair. I believe that we have a righteous wind at our backs, and that as we stand on the crossroads of history, we can make the right choices and meet the challenges that face us. Thank you very much, everybody. God bless you.
Faith speech. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things not yet seen. Yet there is one final part to this jigsaw, and it's the call to action. There needs to be action which follows these calls, this vision, the call to action, probably best expressed.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
The final part of that, the first part is very familiar. The second part, where he's talking about the rest of the world and how they sort of see America, but how they also got to come together and unite to actually, for common purpose, is part of a call which I would say would be symptomatic of all faith speeches, that it has to have a call to action. You inspire, you excite, you enthuse, people have faith, you go on and progress despite difficulties, despite setbacks. There's this call to action, which is then action. Why is this important? Why does faith matter? Why does faith speech matter? In very uncertain times, the difficulties and the problems that we face become sort of magnified, that we look and we see in the here and now, in the immediate, our own circumstances, our own condition, the condition of the world. Yet a bigger view, which I believe comes specifically from either people of faith, people speaking faith, or people who've just sensed that there is a bigger, higher self, even within themselves, that needs to be reached to, so that we can go on and not be content in where we are, but through faith move on to where we want to be. Thank you very much.
Well, colleagues, I think you'll agree we've had three really tremendous presentations. That last one reminded me, Lee, that when I worked for Neil Kinnock and he was recruiting a speechwriter, the requirement in recruiting a speechwriter was simply that the speechwriter was familiar in detail with the Bible, but also significantly with the works of Shakespeare. And he recruited the son of a bishop to do the job, thus demonstrating your point. We're now going to go, we've got half an hour for questions and comments, and I am going to suggest we are fairly liberal about it. If you have things you'd like to say rather than just to ask, please do. I'm going to take them in threes. But what I'm just going to kick off, if usurping this privilege, if I might, is just to ask the panel. Rachel, in your presentation, you made reference to offence as opposed to hatred and other words. Could I just ask the panel whether, either legally or in any other way, there is a sense of clarity about what is seen as offensive in these kinds of speech that ought to be constrained in some ways or ought not to be constrained in some kinds of ways? I was interested in your use of the word offence as opposed to the hatred word. So I just wonder if I could ask each of you just to firstly say a word on that, and then I'll come to the body of the hall and, as I say, take comments in threes. Rachel, do you want to say anything about that? Yes.
I mean, legally, there is no crime for propagating offensive speech, whereas clearly there is with hate speech. And I suppose, I mean, some of what I was saying was slightly simplistic in the sense that it implied that it's clear what the boundary between hate speech and offensive speech might be, when of course, it really isn't. But I think offence has become a very key term in some of those arenas that I was describing, which are not legal arenas. So on university campuses, the issue of offence is often invoked in order to no platform speakers, for instance, or, as I said in the case of publishers, they're designed not to offend certain readers, affected the way the book was produced. So I think offence is a powerful term, but it's not a legal term as such. And, you know, yeah, it's complicated. I don't know if that's quite...
No, it does help. Alex.
I think is my mic working? Yeah. So I'm going to be cheeky here and actually defer the answer to someone I think you should read. So there's an American scholar called Joel Feinberg who wrote these incredible treatises on the nature of harm. The first one's harm to others. The second one's on offence to others. Until I read that book, I was convinced in my mind that Mill was correct about this issue, that if there are any limits on free speech, it must only be where there's been some concrete harm or some incitement to concrete harm, and that mere offence, merely being offended by something, is the other side of the regulatable. And of course, there are lots of countries where offending religious belief absolutely is a criminal offence, in many Muslim countries, for example, not here. Until I read Joel...
The blasphemy was in the law until recently.
Indeed. Until I read Joel Feinberg, and he sets out over 300 pages the case for why offence could be regulatable. And he points out the ways in which some forms of offence can cause such a visceral shock, existential affront, emotional distress, such impact in such specific circumstances to particular types of people that we shouldn't just discount it as being the potential for regulation. So my answer is read Joel Feinberg, and hopefully you'll find it as interesting as I did.
Have you read Joel Feinberg?
I haven't, but I will do. I haven't a lot to add, really, other than it's a problem if anybody offends anybody else's faith or beliefs. And part of what I've been talking about today in terms of faith speech is that the differentiation between faith speech and people of faith talking about other people in terms of hate speech or insisting on their right to free speech is that it always seeks to unify rather than to divide. And yeah, so whether it should be prescribed, made legal, whatever, I think that's the principle which I'd sort of work on.
Thanks very much. Now we've got two excellent colleagues with mics around. Can I see people indicating, please? Gentleman down here. First the lady there, just right next to you. Then the gentleman down here, and then third person. Yes, the gentleman here. So, lady there. Could I just ask all of you to give your name, please?
I'm Sally Broughton-Mitsuwa. I'm a colleague of Alex and Lee. And I want to thank the panel for a very interesting presentation. So, first one to answer Alex's question, as a religious person of faith, I do accept that there should be some limits on my speech. As somebody who actually works in the area of freedom of expression, I'm struggling with where do you make the balance, and the fact that there is not a lot of guidance on what actually constitutes incitement to hatred or hate speech for many of those who are actually making those decisions. And I think that one of the big problems we're facing is actually the privatization of those decisions, which mean that they're leaning too much in protecting themselves from being platforms for causing offense, and overstepping, being overly cautious perhaps in the area of hate speech without sufficient recourse for the defense of freedom of speech by other actors. And the example I'm working with right now is video sharing platforms and social media, which are doing a lot of this right now and being called upon increasingly to regulate this themselves. The other thing that struck me about what you're saying is that I'm wondering about this long-term conditions of fomenting hate, where there isn't exactly a threat in the actual speech, but the long-term progress means that you have increased incidents of hate crimes like we've seen with immigrants in recent months. And where do you then draw that line if you're not looking at incidences of specific speech, but long-term climate of hate? And I want to ask Lee, are you making a distinction between faith speech, which has a call for unity and, I would say, positive things, and religious speech, which sometimes doesn't do that?
Thanks very much. The gentleman at the front here, the mic's just coming to you now. Thank you very much.
Ian Smith. I'd like to raise the question of laws on blasphemy. I understand we still have on the statute book in this country a law on blasphemy against the Christian religion.
No, it came off about 2 years ago. Sorry, not 2 years ago. I'd say probably 2008, would it be, Alex?
Yeah.
The racial and religious hatred
Yes.
bill, yeah, it was.
Anyway, about 8 or 9 years ago it came off, but up till then it had
If
been.
there had been, I was going to say, is there a case for extending it to other religions as well? I was particularly struck in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo affair and some of the opinion polls that took place in this country, just how much holding the prophet up to ridicule and contempt is not just a question of making offence. It's actually striking at the very core of people's being. And if there was such a law, which could be actually implemented in certain extreme cases, I think it would be in the interest of a harmonious, multiracial society. Professor Marsden said, in almost a throwaway line, oh, we all live in a secular world here. Actually, we don't. There is a considerable minority of this country who are very devout believers. Not only Muslims, but I'm thinking particularly of Muslims. Unless we recognize that, and that for them, attacks on their prophet is actually trumps anything to do with free speech, okay? You can have free speech on anything else, but you attack the very core of their being by holding up their prophet to contempt. That is something I think we should not tolerate in a multi-racial, multi-faith society.
Thank you. And the gentleman just there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting sort of talk from all of you. Professor Marsden, I'm a bit sort of concerned about sort of some of your justifications here. I understand sort of why you're making them, but particularly sort of this notion that where there is no vision, the people sort of perish. Oh, sorry, that where there is no vision, the people perish. And it strikes me that sort of, I understand sort of why you put that sort of forward. it's potentially sort of very dangerous, which is always the case when you extract sort of notions from religious texts, and actually they can be used in many different ways. I don't think anybody here would sort of doubt that Islamic State, for example, does not have sort of a vision, but whether the people will do anything better than perish is another matter. One could say the same thing about the Nazis. So I think you have to be very careful about the justifications that you actually provide for the value of sort of faith speech.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go Alex, Rachel, Lee. Alex.
Okay, so on Sally's question, my research is showing me that there's almost becoming a division of labour, with the government saying we have these hate speech laws, we will pursue them and enact them and apply them, and we're looking at any examples that come our way. And we're looking at the internet, but there's a resourcing issue. And then companies like Facebook, Twitter, Google, having their hate speech regulations and guidance, and dealing with masses, billions of examples of content, and thousands of moderators making instant one-click decisions of removing things or not. And it seems that the government, because of the quantity, is kind of almost allowing these private enterprises to do the job. And one thing that occurs to me that the real difference is that if we look at statutes on inciting hatred in the UK, so where it states what the law is, it runs into many pages, but far more important, there's a case law now. So we've had this law since 1965, and it's been adding and adding. And the wisdom of law is in the case law. And judges sifting through cases, providing remarks, clarifications, distinctions, explanations, and that's where the wisdom is. The problem with the online moderators is that they don't publish their decisions, and their guidance is hate speech is not acceptable on Facebook. Right? It doesn't tell us what it is, how they're making a decision, don't publish them. And I agree, that's an issue, that's a real worry. In terms of the issue around speech directly causing hate crimes or violence and so on, I see it as a two-stage process. So first you try and justify why we should have these laws at all, and then we do appeal to the way in which certain language builds to a climate of hatred, which is classified by having certain heightened risks of hate crime. But once we've justified that law and we're applying it to a particular case, the question before the courts is, did this person intentionally stir up hate speech or not? So we're not asking whether they specifically caused a particular harm. It's too high a bar. And then I just want to say something on Ian's question about blasphemy laws. This is really interesting because actually, before we had laws saying that it would be an offence to stir up religious hatred, we only had racial hatred. And the question was, why should we have religious hatred as well as part of these laws? And the main argument was around differential treatment of Jews and Muslims. So Jews were treated as a race, so you couldn't stir up hatred against Jews, but Muslims were treated as a religious group, and so you could. And the question is, what should we do about that lack of parity? And at the time, some people were saying, well, what we should do is increase blasphemy laws. That's what Muslims want. So we'll give them equal blasphemy laws for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. The other option was to repeal all blasphemy laws and extend the stirring up hatred offences. And it's the second way we went. And if you were going to ask me why we went that way, it was a belief that blasphemy laws, even if given parity to all religions, pose a much greater danger to free speech than very tightly drawn stirring up hatred offences. Because one thing you notice about the stirring up offences is you must use threatening language. And that kind of really narrows the sorts of cases you could go after. In the case of blasphemy, there isn't that narrowness. That's how it played out.
And isn't it also the case that there was real difficulty in understanding when you'd ever use a blasphemy law? I can't remember when it had last been used until it was gone, but actually, how did you define blasphemy in order to be able to take action? At least the virtue of the incitement to hatred concept was that there was a concept of incitement to hatred. Rachel.
I mean, just picking up on that point, and thank you for the question. I mean, there were obviously strong blasphemy laws in place. and they were used regularly in the 18th century and 19th century, and then they kind of fell into sort of, you know, they just weren't invoked. And it's a good question, Charles, but I think the last case was a case that involved a publication called Gay News, and it was in the 1970s, and it literally hadn't been invoked since then, and it was almost, someone said it was like a dead letter, effectively. And then after the Satanic Verses affair, a number of Muslim groups said, well, we want to try and, you know, take this book to court and with blasphemy laws. But of course, the blasphemy laws specifically related to Christianity. And it was in the wake of that actually the Labour government started to introduce legislation to try and introduce this new bill, which is the Religious and Racial Hatred Bill, in which they extended the protections to a number of different groups, including differently defined religious groups, so not just Christians, but religious groups as such. But there was a big battle over that piece of legislation. The Blair government had to introduce it a number of times, and free speech groups were very worried about it in its original form. A number of high-profile comedians, I don't know if you remember this, came out, such as Rowan Atkinson, and said, if this legislation goes through, potentially if I tell a joke, a religious joke, I could be prosecuted. So they fought to have that legislation tightened. But the point is that, I suppose, in answer to your question, that if you have those protections about offence, you are talking about potentially curtailing free speech. Now, I think the point you make about the offence being something that is central to the very being of the people involved is a really good one, because sometimes people talk about religion as though it's a kind of choice. You choose to believe in a religion, and so therefore it's different than if you're being targeted because you're part of a racial minority. You don't choose your race, there's nothing you can do about it. So to be persecuted on those grounds is one thing, but you choose your religion, it's somehow connected to something that is intellectual, right? And I think that's false, because religious belief is part of a whole set of things. It's about a set of codes and practices and social codes and community issues. It's not something that's merely chosen. So I think that's a very good point. But at the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that if you produce a strong blasphemy law or stronger prohibitions on the right to offend religious faith, then you are also eking away at the rights of freedom of expression. And that's the balance that has to be struck.
Thank you. Just to add one historical note, what actually happened was the bill in the House of Lords was, the House of Lords passed an amendment to deal with the point that was raised.
Yeah.
It carried it, and then in the Commons, the government was defeated by a handful of votes in trying to turn round the House of Lords amendments, and so that House of Lords amendment then is part of the bill, which now exists now. Lee.
Great. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Sally, am I making a distinction between faith speech and religious speech? Absolutely. Religious speech could be Trump, Thatcher, sticking in quotations into speeches. Can be pastors speaking. Could be a whole host of different things. I'm making a very specific liberation. And that faith speech doesn't actually have to be by a religious person. The reality, of course, is that because of background, because of tapping into sort of that shared sort of history and experience, then very often these people will be people of faith, but not exclusively. And so, you know, a socialist who has a sort of a vision for a better world, I'd still see as being part of faith speech as well, providing that the other things which I mentioned are also sort of adhered to in that faith speech. So, coming to your question, sorry, I didn't catch your name, but you make a really valid point. You know, that you must be wary of using scriptural texts randomly or sort of or use it because they have the power to be very harmful, and I entirely agree. Now, in terms of putting up that particular sort of quote from Proverbs, where there's no vision, the people perish. I also mentioned it was under restraint, but basically that things fall apart if there's no vision. Now, you can have lots of different visions. I mentioned Islamic State have got a vision, Nazis had a vision, lots of people. So you can't just take one of these sort of things out and analyse it sort of by itself. Preceding that comes the idea of identifying the problem, the appeal to a higher self. Now, that appeal to the higher self could be to God and could be to religious faith and experience. It could equally be, as it happens very often in sort of the American case, where it's an appeal to American values. We've got a session next week on British values. You know, it might be appeal to British values, but it's that force which sort of goes beyond yourself and your own thoughts, actually to a higher authority in the sense of, you know, this is something we can sort of ascribe to. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, you can sort of, yeah, with everything which I've said, you could make sort of a good motivational speech, and anybody could take it out of context. So you have to sort of hear the spirit with which I'm saying that, that in terms of the examples which I've given that appeal to a higher self, to our better instincts, you know, couldn't apply to the Fury because, you know, people know
it also
deep
applies,
down.
Though, to all these crackpot Christian minorities that have arisen in the USA over the years.
I'll take your question.
Because you know, our higher self is not reflected in those crackpots. So the vision comes from that sort of background, really. Yeah, and that sort of higher authority becomes important. So I accept what you're saying. You know, it can be a difficult to sort of using sort of statements out of context. But as I say, if you see it in the round in terms of this appeal to our better instincts.
Hang on a second. I am going to take other people in the hall.
There doesn't need to, well, the consensus becomes because it resonates with people.
Just so one other point that Sally made I thought was important, the long-term, short-term point, how one can build a society where essentially you build a situation which is resilient in relation to all these discussions. And I think that's a bigger, more wide-ranging discussion than we're talking about now, but it's an important consequence. I've got time for one more round of questions. Can I see indicators? Gentleman there, gentleman here. I've got three. Are there any more that I've missed? Okay, we'll kick off up there first, and then there's going to be somebody right at the back.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. My name's Oliver Stewart. I'm a PhD student here in PPL. One of the questions that comes to my mind is the no platform policy we're seeing on university campuses. And the idea of free speech, or what I would call selective speech, where we're seeing particularly notable figures such as Germaine Greer banned from university campuses for expressing her views of radical feminism, which were acceptable back in the day, perhaps in the 1960s and 70s, but now seem to be offending groups such as the transgender community. And a question I would like to put forward is, are we looking at absolute value of free speech, or is actually free speech all relative?
Okay, there was somebody just here. That's right, you, sir. Mike's just coming right now.
My name is Peter Hinge. I'm a travelling evangelist. I'm often preaching and speaking on the streets. I'm very concerned about what happened in Bristol 2 weeks ago, and two men who were preaching and reading from the Bible were prosecuted and heavily fined. And I think maybe that could be a threat to free speech. I'd like to point out that a few years before, another case came to court and it was dismissed in the High Court. And in that dismissal, Lord Justice Sidley said that the irritating, the contentious, the eccentric, the heretical, the unwelcome and the provocative have a right to be heard. Do you feel that we're getting freedom of speech threatened by what's happened in Bristol?
Thank you. There was somebody just back there. Sorry, big one. You're down here. That's right. You, sir, here. And it's somebody right at the back.
Hi, I'm Lawrence Bache. Sorry, my phone was just switched off. In a multi-faith society, people's beliefs and views should be protected, but also at the same time, do you think for them to be accepted into public discourse, that those people holding the beliefs and views should be open to criticism, whether that is ridicule or otherwise, that may cause offence?
Okay, and then finally is the person right at the back.
My question really about speech.
Could you just give your name, please?
Tim Waite is my name.
Thank you.
And my question is generally about speech. And I've not heard the mention of the word belief or truth and how that can create all of these things.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go Lee, Alex, Rachel in response. Lee first, please.
Okay. Prosecution of evangelist, Peter's question, and the right to be heard. I do believe people have the right to be heard. I think there is a danger of closing down debate. I think we see it across student unions, and particularly across the country. And I think that those conversations, in terms of what people say, may be unpleasant. But I do think that people have the right to be able to make those speeches. I'm very wary of being selective in terms of who we allow to speak and who we don't allow to speak. I think there's ways in which speech should be conducted, which I think should be respectful, and I think you shouldn't deliberately cause an offence. I'm undecided in terms of exactly where the law should fall on that, but free exercise of religion would seem to me to be quite an important right. And I think possibly the evangelists have fallen foul of that, and shouldn't be prosecuted. We won't have to agree with everybody and everything that is said, but the right for people to be able to make these comments and to express their beliefs, I think, is very, very important. Lawrence, multi-faith beliefs and views should be accepted, and
should the person making them be able to?
Should they be able to be ridiculed for that? Well, absolutely. I mean, I think again, it's a matter of whether you want to cause offence or not. Some people do. I mean, I think in public forum, then there should be strong sort of chairing or whatever of debates to try and avoid offence. But I think anybody who has any strong beliefs, then part of the name of the game is that you can be offended.
Okay, Alex?
So, first on the question of the no platforming, I think it's a fascinating and difficult issue. I think there are two things going on that I want to ask. One is when someone's being no platformed, is it on the grounds that the people no platforming them genuinely believe that what they're going to say could be contrary to the law or not? And I think if they genuinely have a good faith belief that this could be contrary to the law, then I think I would be a lot more inclined to be sympathetic. And in the case of some of Jermaine Greer's speech, some aspects, some sentences within that speech look like threatening. Some of the language, some of the violent language he uses about lopping off, and could be seen as stirring up hatred against a group by claiming that group has certain ulterior motives or has a power play. So if the no platform was done for that reason, then that's one thing. A second issue going on here is the public-private distinction. So in the United States, the no platforming debate is really centered on publicly funded universities. In the United States, when it comes to a privately funded university, like any private organisation, you can invite or not invite whomever you choose. It's your money to do with as you wish. But when it comes to a public university, does that public university have an obligation to almost provide a kind of a content neutrality approach to who it hires, who it invites, who doesn't? That a bit like a news station. Does it have an obligation to provide a spectrum of perspectives on any issue? And my view, there's potentially yes, that if the speaker is actually not saying anything that could remotely be illegal, just merely offensive, then I think a publicly funded institution should not no platform that person. It'd be like the BBC not no platforming Nick Griffin. They didn't no platform him, they allowed him to speak, and I think he showed himself for what he was, and I think it was rather successful. I'll stop there in the interest of not hogging the answer.
Thank you. You could have kept going. Rachel.
I think context is key. So Peter, in the case of the evangelist, no, I think that person should have been allowed to speak freely. I don't see that they were infringing any laws, as far as I could tell, and I would defend their rights to speak. With the case of the no platforming, Oliver, universities are slightly different spaces. I mean, they're sort of, what you're talking about there are student unions, which are often self-governing. They're run by students. So it's not exactly in the public sphere in quite the same way as the evangelist in Bristol. And it's up to those students, I guess, to decide who they do or do not want to invite to speak. My impulse is to have more opinion and expression rather than less. My impulse would be not to prohibit people from speaking unless there were extremely good reasons for doing so. Certainly if they were infringing the law in any way, then of course that's one thing. But the issue around no platforming and the issue around offence is often not about the law, it's about other issues. But, it's a very complicated question, and I wouldn't feel I had the right to sort of decide for those students in effect, and I think the forum is key there, the context in which it takes place. Tim, you said we hadn't spoken about belief or truth. The one thing I did say about truth, I suppose, was one of the classic arguments for free speech is the pursuit of truth, and that's the John Stuart Mill argument that the exchange of opinion is fundamental to the pursuit and the discovery of truth. And that's one reason why I suppose in general I'm in favour of free speech. I'm in favour of Nick Griffin saying what he has to say and then people making the decision for themselves rather than saying you're not allowed to speak, which I think, potentially gives him a sort of kudos that I don't think he necessarily deserves. So I'm generally in favour of that, and it's partly because of that liberal argument, I suppose, about the exchange of opinion being a good thing, the pursuit of truth. So,
you want to say something else, Alex?
Sorry, so coming back to the question on street preachers or evangelists being prosecuted or potentially prosecuted, and there's been lots of cases over the years, and I suspect it's going to be under sections 4, 4A or 5 of the Public Order Act 1986 to do with not being permitted to insult, alarm or distress people with your speech. And there's a hate crime penalty enhancement legislation which would allow you to tweak the offence to give an enhanced sentence if that insult, alarm or distress was motivated by racial, religious or sexual orientation. So it was just a pure case of insult, alarm or distress.
I'd just like to make a couple of comments on what's been said. I think the whole of the presumption ought to be in favour of people being able to speak freely in universities and so on. I think some of the trends, for example, on people like Germaine Greer, are unacceptable, actually. I think that the impulse should be for people to speak freely. I agree with Rachel that, of course, nobody's got an obligation to invite people who, on any kind of general basis, but the general presumption ought to be that happens. That's why I'm interested in the word offence. I was very actively engaged in this phrase incitement to hatred. I think that is a clear distinction. If you're actually inciting hatred against people, that is a qualitatively different thing to offending people or saying things that other people find difficult in what happens. And I think it's perfectly okay to say things that people find difficult and even to offend people, but it's not acceptable to incite to hatred. But a word that hasn't occurred this evening, which I think is quite interesting from this point of view, is provocation. I think there are people who set out to provoke. The example which wasn't mentioned, which predated Charlie Hebdo, the Danish cartoons, I think there was a serious issue about that. Firstly, it fell absolutely slap into the point about international, which you made, Rachel, in your introduction. But there was a serious effort to provoke. And I think it was extremely interesting, and by the way, to me, surprising, that the British newspapers didn't republish the Danish cartoons about the Prophet. I was surprised that that took place, and I still am not clear. You gave 2 reasons why it happened, which were given. I'm not sure what really was their thinking behind it. But I do think it's important to create a climate in which people don't set about trying to provoke others in the way that they operate. And that, of course, is very difficult to define in law. In fact, I don't think you could define it in law. But I think as a conduct of society, it is beneficial if people don't want to provoke other people and don't set about provoking other people. And so I just wanted to say that too at the end. I think you will all agree we've had 3 fantastic presentations and a really excellent discussion. I hope that you feel we've had a good start to this particular Keswick Hall series of lectures. So can we express our thanks to the speakers for what I think has been a really tremendous evening. Thank you very much.